How about that one?
Bit green up close.
That one's flickering.
Yeah. Sorry, thought I'd fix that.
Who are you?
I'm the Doctor.
Doctor Who?
I hate this chair.
Alright, so in today's video I thought I'd do something a bit different and talk about how I would rank all the Series 11 episodes from worst to best. Now please bear in mind that when I say best, it's still the best out of a really, really, really bad pile of Doctor Who episodes. So it's kind of like trying to find a gold nugget in a pile of shit. It's very difficult, but I will try nonetheless. So with that said, let's get on with the list. So coming in at number 10, we have the Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos, or as I put it in my notes, the Battle of Thing, because I couldn't be bothered writing out Ranskoor of Kolos, mainly because I didn't know how to spell such a ridiculous word. To me, this episode just symbolises everything wrong with Series 11. It has no real stakes, it's in the most boring, barren location imaginable. Some of the effects look really weak, particularly with the, what they called, the Uks. I couldn't remember their names. When they're sort of manipulating rocks and stuff, that looks something like straight out of a PS2 game. Tim Shaw was never a great villain to begin with. He was decent, and I think they knew he was decent, which is why they brought him back for the finale. They knew that they only had one half-decent villain to bring back. I mean, who else were they going to bring back? Krasko. Yeah, this one's just a really bad one of the bunch. It's just boring. You know, I actually had times when I was rewatching it where I was nodding off. And it's like a grab bag of ideas that just don't work together. As many people have stated, it has a lot of parallels to Stolen Earth Journey's End, with the planets that have been captured in these crystals and they get released, and it just doesn't feel like there's any threat. As well, obviously, Tim Shaw threatens to vaporize the Earth, and in any other series that would be high stakes, but because we haven't really got to know anyone on Earth besides from the companions who are with the Doctor and not on Earth, it kind of feels weightless. It's not like in, say, again, to reference Stolen Earth Journey's End, when you had all the companions on Earth, all of the Doctor's Children of Time, which is what they were called, fighting the good fight on Earth. So there was a real sense of urgency to try and save everyone on Earth. But because we don't know anyone on Earth for this series, the consequences just aren't there. They're not apparent as they would be, you know, in either the Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat eras. So yeah, this episode just falls a bit flat. It could have been a really good opportunity to explore the character dynamics a little bit with the emotional sort of, I don't know what they're called, inhibitors, where they sort of prevent the planet from interfering with the thoughts of the companions. I think it would have been really cool to have the Doctor and one of the companions argue. It could have added another layer of character to those companions, particularly Yaz. I feel like if the Doctor and Yaz had an argument, it could have really solidified their characters and made their characters a lot more interesting than they were. But we didn't get that. The one thing I will commend this episode on is the fact that Graham, at the very least, says no to the Doctor and disagrees with the Doctor. That's kind of the closest that we ever get to them having a disagreement. And it was nice to see them not all just nod and go along with what the Doctor says, like they normally do. That's the one thing I'll commend it for. The music is probably at one of its worst in this episode. Nitpicks put it best when he said, Tim Shaw's music sounds like a reverbed fart. and that's completely accurate. Yeah, this episode is just not a good episode at all, and you're going to hear that phrase a lot in these next couple of ratings here, but I honestly can't say much more about this other than the fact that it sucks. So at number 10, we've got The Witchfinders. Now, many of you will think that some other episodes could come here. I know some people think Arachnids is worse, some people think that It Takes You Away is worse. Everyone's ranking of these episodes is completely different. But The Witchfinders, to me, is a particularly bad one. It's visually unappealing, much like the Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos, that basically just uses a quarry. So it's kind of like classic Who, except it feels even more cheap because you know they have the budget to do more than that now. But anyway, The Witchfinders, that's it. Again, like Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos, the colour scheme is just completely grey. It's not visually pleasing to look at whatsoever. The 13th Doctor is probably at her most annoying in this episode, and that's difficult to say because she's annoying in multiple episodes of hers, but this one in particular, she really grated on me. The villain, the Morax, is just a laughable villain. I actually laughed when they said that they came out of a tree. Thing is, like, when you have a villain, you've got to try and build them up as threatening. And saying that they come out of a random tree in, Becca Savage's garden, that's not the best way to build up an antagonist. You've got the Daleks, conquerors of universes. You've got Cybermen, converted humans that believe that all emotions are dead. And you've got the Morax, the people who climb out of trees. It's just not threatening whatsoever. Also, the Morax King, the effects on the Morax King are really, really bad. Like, it does feel like something out of a poorer episode of Classic Who. But again, as I said, it doesn't feel as bad in Classic Who because you knew that they had a limited budget to work with and they were trying their best. With this, it just feels even more cheap. Don't ask me how they get green flames in those torches, because I couldn't tell you. Of course, we've got the ham-fisted female angle with the whole, oh, women weren't treated very well in the 16th century, like we didn't know that already. It's just a bad episode all around, and it's one of my all-time least favourite episodes, which again is something you're going to hear a lot. The only saving grace of this episode, as many have pointed out, is King James. I think he knew, Alan Cummings knew how bare bones this script was, so he just made it as hammy and entertaining as he possibly could. And to be fair, he does do that. He tries his very best. Also, in this episode, the Yorkshire accents really started to get on my nerves. This is no offence to the people who live in Yorkshire, obviously. I'm sure you're all great, and I've been to Yorkshire and you're all alright. It's just, in this episode, they all just sound really irritating, and I can't put my finger on it. As Harry's Moving Castle pointed out, when Yaz is calling out to Willa, it sounds like she's saying Willy. And once you hear that, and once you hear Harry's Moving Castle saying that, you can't really unhear it. It's sort of burnt onto your ears that that's how it sounds. But yeah, overall this episode is just a mess. The effects don't work, the story doesn't work, the characters don't work, the Doctor doesn't work, the companions don't work, nothing about this works. Moving on. Number 9. The Arachnids in the UK. Or, I think it's just Arachnids in the UK, so I didn't need to add the at the beginning. But Arachnids in the UK presented an interesting prospect. As far as I'm aware, we hadn't really seen a Cyberman? A spider-based story since, like, the John Pertwee era. So it could have been a really good way to pay homage to the classic era. But they didn't do that. Now, one thing I will commend this episode on is the effects on the spiders and the webs. The spiders, when I first saw them, I actually thought, wow, they look really good for Doctor Who spiders-wise. Because obviously, as I said, some of the spiders in Doctor Who have been a little bit hit or miss, or spider-esque creatures. Take, for example, the one in the Lazarus experiment in particular is a pretty historic example, as well as the Empress of the Arachnids from The Runaway Bride. Yeah, Doctor Who's had a bit of a rocky relationship with spiders, but these look really good. The problem is literally just everything else. We get shown Yaz's family in this episode, which you would think would lead to some interesting story opportunities, but surprise, surprise, it doesn't. You learn basically nothing about her family in this episode, besides the fact that the dad's a bad cook, which is kind of bad that the male in the house is a bad cook. That's a bit of a stereotype, but we'll move past that. Also, this is when the Doctor tries to be all socially awkward, but it doesn't read as socially awkward, it reads as overly quirky to me, like she's trying too hard, and that can get really irritating. There's one line in particular that grinded my gears. It's when they're all getting out the TARDIS, and she's like, "Oh, let's go for tea at Yaz's." That really got to me. It just added to my hatred of the accent, to be honest. As in every episode as well, the sonic screwdriver usage is extremely overt and is used way too heavily. You would think that, again, this episode would be a pretty straightforward affair, but of course they have to add some political message in, and for the chopping block this week was Donald Trump. Now, I will admit, I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump. I mean, to be honest, I don't really care about American politics at all. As far as I'm concerned, they don't affect me. But, to be honest, I don't really want to listen to a Trump parody when I'm trying to watch my Doctor Who. It's just a personal preference of mine. And what's amusing is at the end of this episode, the Trump guy actually ends up with the moral high ground. Because in the final scene, the Doctor, Yaz, Graham, and all the companions, Yaz's mum as well is there. Oh yeah, Yaz's mum is there for basically no apparent reason other than why not? They hired the actor, might as well shoot some extra scenes with her. But they're all there, and the spider is dying. It's in pain, agony. It's about to die, and the Trump guy shoots it. Now this is something people have talked about before, but surely that was the merciful way to kill it. If it was torturing, if it was like torture to live, if it was feeling pain, if it didn't want to live anymore, surely leaving it to slowly die would not be the humane thing to do. So the Trump guy does the sensible thing, and he gets slagged off for it. And our Doctor wanted to leave it to suffocate. Our hero of the story, our protagonist, who we are supposed to root for, wanted to leave the spider to die in a room. Just think about that for a minute. I think this was the first example where the Doctor really didn't feel like the Doctor. In earlier episodes, she didn't feel completely like the Doctor, more like she was acting like the Doctor. But this episode marked the first time where she didn't even feel like she acted like the Doctor. So, yeah, this episode, again, is just a really, really, really boring exercise. Also, there's a scene where the Trump guy pulls out a gun on Yaz and her mum. Now, I thought that her police experience would come into play here, and she would say, "You're under arrest for use of a gun," because, in case you didn't know, in case my American audience didn't know, the use of a gun in the UK is illegal. So she could have easily said, "You're under arrest." But no, she allows this man to carry a gun around. Oh, this is just so bad. It reminds me of, a really bad Scooby-Doo episode. You know what I mean? And not in, the fun way. In, this is really cheesy and really, really obvious who the villain is. Kind of like an old Captain Planet episode. It just doesn't work. There's just too much of a mishmash of tones and Again, the colour is very, very dim in this episode. None of the companions really get much development. The Doctor really doesn't get any development. And it just sucks. Also, the Doctor references Ed Sheeran and starts saying stuff like fam. And it's when she really started to annoy me. So moving on, number 8, the Suranga conundrum. Now, I think a lot of people will agree that Suranga conundrum was probably the blandest of the series. At least with the previous ones, they had something for you to remember about them. Obviously, with the Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos, you had like Tim Shaw coming back, and the Ux in the Witchfinders. You had the King James and the terrible Morax villain. In Arachnids, you had Donald Trump and the suffocating spider. This just had nothing whatsoever. We are introduced in this episode to probably the most laughable Doctor Who villain in history, the Pating, that does look like the live-action version of Lilo and Stitch. I'm not even joking. It looks terrible, and it actually almost does us a service by destroying the sonic screwdriver, but no, it works 2 seconds later. I'm really struggling to talk about this one, to be honest. This one is a really, really bad one, and I've said that about all of them, but this one in particular is very difficult to remember, even though I try to rewatch some of these for the ranking. We've got some Z-list actors. We got Doc Brown, who made his fame through rapping and the 4 O'Clock Club on CBBC. We've got an android that doesn't really look like an android. It just looks like his face has been painted white. The ship is a very lazy design. It just looks like a white hallway. That's all you ever see of it. We also have the pregnant man. I know a lot of people got up in arms about this, but I honestly couldn't care less. Like, it wasn't too over. It was just a bit silly. And, you know, silly can sometimes be good. There's a difference between entertaining silly and stupid silly. And this was just stupid silly, in my opinion. What else was there? I'm genuinely struggling. Oh, yeah. The 13th Doctor's behaviour actually gets reprimanded by a white male, but what happens to him 2 seconds later? He gets jettisoned out of the ship. Take from that whatever you will. This one is just so bland. I'm genuinely struggling to remember every aspect of it. Probably the only positive that came out of it was Bradley Walsh saying how he was squeamish at the bits of Call the Midwife. That was pretty funny, admittedly. Other than that, this is just boring. And I've started to notice, I used to have an admiration for Tosin Cole. He used to be one of my, one of the better parts of this series. But when I look back on it, he delivers everything the same. Like, everything is on the same monotone, wavelength. His pitch never changes, his voice never changes, it all just stays the same. Now, that could be down to the fact that he's just growing into the character, and he did seem to become more confident at the end of Resolution, but I just hope that continues throughout Series 12. But overall, this episode was just boring. Oh yeah, and the most dangerous creature in the universe can be kicked like a football by Yaz. Explain that one. Also, I thought the most dangerous creatures in the universe were the Daleks. So, I suppose it's just another example of Chibnall wanting to implant himself onto the show. At number 7, we have It Takes You Away. Now, visually, It Takes You Away is a lot better than some of the other episodes I've talked about. It actually has some colours, and it actually has some scientific concepts, like a parallel universe, and a, sort of corridor to get between universe to universe. It gave me a lot of Coraline vibes, if you've ever seen that movie. But at the same time, this one is difficult, because it has its good elements, but it also has some really, really poor elements as well. So, the scenery in Norway is visually, aesthetically pleasing. It's nice to see the landscapes in Norway. Too bad that takes up, like, what, 2% of the episode? Jodie Whittaker is once again very annoying in this episode. There's one line in particular where she starts eating grass and says, "Oh, there's a place with a very bad TripAdvisor rating." I'm just like, please be quiet. I really wanted to put her on the naughty chair at points when she's talking. It's just really, really grating to listen to. And some of you might say that I'm really grating to listen to, but you're still watching, so... But anyway, this episode I've talked about before. A lot of people got up in arms about the representation that Dad's got in this episode, how they were basically treated as, evil by leaving their daughter to, suffer inside a house that she was terrified of. But to be honest, I was more upset by the representation that people with disabilities got. Now, I've mentioned this before in a video, but I've got a lot of new subscribers since then, so most of you probably won't have seen that video. But in that video, I basically talked about how that character is pretty much all of the stereotypes of disabled characters. They have to be protected. They have to be looked after. They can't go out on their own. They are constantly afraid. They can't do things for themselves. It just wraps all the negative stereotypes of disabled people into one character and puts it on screen. Now, I will give credit to the actress, as I believe she is actually blind, and credit to her, she does a great job. But still, I just don't like the way she is basically utilised in this episode. People go on about how, you can't have a damsel in distress. But, like, in most television shows I know that feature a disabled character, they're more often than not something to be looked after or protected or, something to be watched over. And I just really don't like how this episode plays into that stereotype at all. It's a stereotype that I've done my best to dispel. But interestingly enough, the people who claim to be champions of equality and respect for everyone, i.e. Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall fans, say some of the most horrible slurs about disabilities I've ever read. So you explain that to me, viewers. You explain to me how people could be so for inclusion and representation and yet slander a minority group at any chance they get. Doesn't quite seem to add up, does it? Okay, I'm going to move on because otherwise this is just going to become a disability rant. But at number 6 we got Rosa. Now, Rosa is probably the most polarising episode of the series, which is probably why I've got it in the middle, because I honestly didn't know where to put it. On the one hand, I wanted it to be further up. I wanted it to be playing with Battle of Ranskoor, Kolos, Witchfinders, Arachnids, all of those. But on the other hand, it wasn't as bad as those. The set design of Rosa is very appealing. It looks like 1950s Montgomery, from at least what I understand. The final scene, besides that dreadful music, is pretty decent. The production values look quite high, and that's something interesting. When an episode doesn't actually have an alien, it looks quite good. But as soon as an alien comes onto the screen, it begins to lose all of that, and it begins to look a lot more Saturday morning cartoon, very cheesy, hammy, visually. But this one actually did look fairly decent. The problem with it is that what it represents. Now, I'm not going to say that what it talked about isn't important. Of course it is. we all need to remember the fact that, we weren't always a progressive society. We weren't always accepting of people of other minority groups, and some of that still holds true today. But the way this episode decided to do it is what I have an issue with. Not once in this episode do we ever see a positive example of a white person in Alabama, which we know for a fact there was. Otherwise, you could argue the civil rights movement never would have happened. Because if there wasn't any, because the way that I understand it is that white people had a lot more power than black people did during the 1950s in America. So therefore, they would have had the power to make the changes and give black Americans the equality that they deserved. So why didn't we see any of that in this episode? It shows a very one-sided slice of the bus boycott movement, and obviously inequality in America as a whole. And personally, I don't know, obviously, a lot about Rosa Parks, but I do know what happened in America in the 1950s, and even earlier than that, with obviously the KKK and stuff. We learn about it through history and stuff in school. At least I do. I don't know whether you did. Let me know in the comments below. But I don't think Americans would be particularly happy with this episode, because it paints them all as racists. And I know for a fact that most aren't. And that's kind of the disheartening thing. That not once do we ever see a positive example of a white American in the 1950s. And I think if they'd have done that, it would have balanced things out a lot better. I'm still not saying that, there weren't bad, white Americans, because of course there were. Otherwise it wouldn't happen. But my point is that they weren't all bad. So this whole thing about, everyone being racist, it wasn't really fair. And this is just without even talking about the villain. Krasko is probably the worst conceived villain ever. I don't count Trump as the main villain of Arachnids in the UK. I think the spiders are the main villain of Arachnids in the UK, because that's what the title of the episode is based off of. But Krasko is the worst main villain of any episode of Doctor Who, I think. He is just there to serve one vital purpose: be racist. And I've said this before, but during Rosa you can really tell which parts were written by Mallory Blackman and which parts were written by Chris Chibnall. Because you go from this hyper-realistic ITV drama style story to a racist carrying around a vortex manipulator and talking about how he's killed 15 people. It just doesn't mesh very well at all. It feels like two different episodes that have been mashed into one. And obviously, I know that both Mallory Blackman and Chris Chibnall worked on this episode, and I think that might be the problem. The problem is that they're two very different creators with two very different visions, and those visions just didn't entirely line up. But again, I will not say that this episode didn't have its positives, because that bus scene, if you change the music, would be perfect. And it did, was a good example, and it was a good representation of the bus boycott movement. And I also liked the fact that the Rosa Parks story was very personal to Graham, because it was something that him and Ryan's Nan talked about a lot, which, is a nice connection to their dynamic. You can tell I'm really, really trying to give this the benefit of the doubt. But overall, it's not bad enough to be rated number 11. But it's not good enough to be in the top 5. So this is where I put it. Be sure, by the way, to put your rankings in the comments down below. So at number 5 then, we've got the Ghost Monument. Now, the Ghost Monument is just forgettable, honestly. The main villains of the piece are the sniper bots, the toilet paper, and the game maker himself. So basically, the idea behind this episode is that it's kind of a race for survival, a sort of Hunger Games-esque idea, if you like, where there's one victor left standing, and they get to reap all the rewards and get a bunch of money and whatever. And obviously, we learn about these two people who are racing to the end of the universe throughout the episode. Now, the interesting thing about this is that they actually get more character development than any of the main cast do in this episode. And that's not a good thing. I feel like Chibnall writes himself into a corner with his characters, where he doesn't know what to do with the ones he's already created, so he just creates new ones to divert from that fact. So we've got the male Hunger Games person and the female Hunger Games person. I know they've got names, but I don't care to remember them. So the male guy talked about how he was dropped out of a tree by his mum when he was young, and she taught him never to trust anybody. And the other woman comes from, I think, a sort of poverty-stricken planet that she wants to win the money to help her family. And you know what Yaz's response to this is? Oh yeah, my family get on my nerves. Like, get some perspective, you know what I mean? Yaz is probably the worst person to talk to if you're feeling down, which sucks because that's often what she's given to do. The Doctor isn't as annoying in this episode as she would go on to be, but she does still have some really cringy lines. For example, she pulls out a £2 pair of sunglasses and says they were Pythagoras's, and you're just like, no they weren't. Also, you've just regenerated and changed into those clothes an episode ago. How did you have time to get Pythagoras's glasses? Did you go back in time to see Pythagoras before this episode took place? But if that's the case, why didn't any of the companions talk about it? Because they would have been there. Do you know what I mean? It's a simple joke, but this simple joke raises a lot of questions. And that's kind of a running gag that 13 has that I kind of wanted to talk about. The whole idea that she's met these famous celebrities over the course of her travels, if you like. And it's kind of like when you got a friend who's been to like Comic-Con or something and met someone you really want to meet and just won't shut up about it. That's kind of what it's like. And it just becomes really grating after a while. Obviously in this episode it was still in its very early stages, so it doesn't quite reach that point in this episode. But the more she does it, the more irritating it gets, to the point where you just wish that she would shut up, you know, and just be quiet. I mean, obviously we know she never will be, because she's the central protagonist of the show, so she kind of has to speak. But yeah, that's something that started in this episode that I find really irritating. What else is in this episode? The Ryan and Graham are basically just there for the ride in this one. Yeah, Yaz doesn't do anything. Pretty much standard at this point. The toilet paper. The toilet paper is probably like one of the most unoriginal, least ambitious monster designs I've ever seen. It's literally just floating toilet paper. And they prophesize this thing called the Timeless Child, which spawned a bunch of fan theories on websites and message boards and servers and chats and whatever else, and it never got revealed. So all those fan theories were for nothing. Isn't that lovely? But yeah, this episode sets up stuff and you think, ooh, where is this going? Where is that going? And it just goes nowhere at all. And that's kind of disappointing to see, because it would have been nice to at least have the timeless child thing be followed up upon. But knowing Chibnall, he'd probably make it something lame. What else was there? Oh yeah, there was a random mention of the Stenza in this episode, so I'm guessing he was trying to build up the Stenza. I've never been a fan of the Stenza anyway, so it really didn't appeal to me. It's not as if he was like teasing the Daleks or anything. He was teasing a monster he reintroduced, well not reintroduced, introduced a brand new monster an episode ago, and was trying to say, oh look, some piece of Stenza technology. Look how amazing that is. Doesn't that really get you excited? And we're all just like, no. Show us a Dalek, then we might get excited. Your Stenza is not an iconic villain. Your Stenza is not the Daleks. Your Stenza is not the Cybermen. It's just a Stenza. Nothing more. Anyway, after that random Stenza tangent, number 4, Demons of the Punjab. Now, to be honest, I thought this would rank higher, but I almost forgot to include this one just because I didn't remember any of it. It takes place about on the partition of India, where Britain was dividing India and Pakistan, and this family, Yaz's family, want to join by marrying Yaz's nan from the Pakistani family and the guy from the Indian family. And they, join together and stuff. The weird thing about this one is that we've already had a story very similar to this in New Who, in Father's Day. And in Father's Day, the Doctor learns that bringing a companion back in time to meet their family is not a good idea and probably shouldn't do it. And yet, she still decides, yeah, how could this go wrong? It's not as if it happened before or anything. So yeah, that's just even more evident that this character just isn't the same character that we've come to love. What else is there? God, I've kind of lost my train of thought at this point. Oh yeah, the villain is so non-threatening. Like, when he says he's gonna kill you, you actually burst out laughing. The actual aliens in this story are just observers. So that's nothing interesting. What else is there in this episode? Not a whole lot, to be honest. Oh yeah, there's that whole scene where the Doctor says, "Oh, I never did this when I was a man." It's like, oh god. Yeah, as you can tell already, she just got more and more irritating to me as time went on. But yeah, that's all I can really say about this one. I will give it credit for talking about a time in history that I wasn't that familiar with. But besides from that, this episode just has nothing to really say. I honestly thought that this episode would be the sort of Yaz-centric episode where we would finally get some character development for Yaz. I mean, I thought Arachnids was going to do that with introducing her family, but no, it didn't. And this one didn't either. They focus more on Yaz's nan, a character that we just met in that episode, more so than Yaz, which I think was a huge missed opportunity. And bear in mind, I'm slagging it off. This is at the number 4 spot. This just goes to show you that I don't really like anything in Series 11. You might just say, oh, well, don't watch it if you don't enjoy it. I was like, I can watch it if I want to, and I can talk about it if I want to. I'm a fan of this show, and I will talk about this show until it improves. And even then, I'll still talk about it. So, yeah. Closing thoughts on this one. It's just kind of boring. It's not badly made, really. It's not. The visuals look pretty good. It's just meh. Okay, so number 3, we actually start getting to some more decent ones now. Number 3, we got Woman Who Fell to Earth. Now, Woman Who Fell to Earth, I would say this, it had me hopeful for Series 11. Before Woman Who Fell to Earth came out, I wasn't sure about this series. When Woman Who Fell to Earth came out, however, while I wasn't super impressed, I could see the potential with it. The problem was, as I've said before, was that the rest of the series never actually followed up on any of the potential. So you just get this whole wasted potential series. But anyway, the episode itself, while not incredible, is decent. And that's probably the best it gets for Series 11, is it's decent. You know, it doesn't really do anything that wrong. It sets up the companions decently well. Ryan's nan dying sets up an actual arc for them throughout the series, so I gotta give props for that. The Doctor isn't too annoying in this episode, mainly because she's either asleep or doesn't really have time to get out any quippy jokes, apart from tongue, smart boy, biology, which is a really, really corny line that honestly made me cringe the first time I heard it. But aside from that, this episode's just well put together. It's not the best thing in the world. The stanza look, okay. It actually has probably the most amount of scope of anything in Series 11, because you go throughout the entirety of Sheffield. You get some lovely shots of Sheffield, particularly at night. So yeah, it's not terrible, but I hesitate to say it was, bad. So I would say slightly above average, maybe a 6 out of 10. I haven't really been ranking these on a numbered system. I've just been ranking them from worst to best, but if I had to give them a score out of 10, this one would probably be like a 6. Okay, number 2, Resolution. Now, this might surprise some people, as for some people, this was the worst episode of Series 11. For me, it's at number 2 purely because it's the most entertaining. It's the most fun I had while watching the series, because it's quite ridiculous when you really think about it, but that's kind of what makes it fun. That's kind of what made me enjoy it, was laughing at it. We have basically a Dalek escaping from ultraviolet rays and possessing a young woman who then reassembles its armor. Meanwhile, the Doctor and her crew are trying to stop it. Yeah, not terrible, but it certainly feels probably one of the most like Doctor Who out of any of the ones I've already talked about. It's the most like Doctor Who out of any of the ones I've already talked about, whereas in a lot of the ones I've already talked about, they don't feel like Doctor Who at all, particularly things like Rosa, the Ghost, not the Ghost Monument, Demons of the Punjab. They don't really feel like Doctor Who episodes, but this did. Was it a great Doctor Who episode? No. It's quite a bad Doctor Who episode, but it was entertainingly bad rather than boringly bad, like most of Series 11. Yeah, that's all I've got to say about this one, because I've already done a review of it, as I have for most of these episodes. But the reason I wanted to do this video was to kind of give my concrete thoughts on all of them, with better effects and visual and audio quality, because the reviews I did were quite crude, other than the Resolution one. The rest were quite crude. So I might have to re-review each individual episode at a later date, but for now, this one is fine. And I actually enjoyed this one, which is something I didn't say throughout the most of Series 11. So, number 1, if you've been keeping track, rather predictably, is KaBlam. Now, what can I say about KaBlam that hasn't already been said? It's telling that the number 1 episode of Series 11 for most fans was the one written by a person who wrote sci-fi before. Perhaps that should tell the BBC something, that hiring children's book writers and feminists probably isn't a good idea if you want a decent sci-fi show. Maybe you should get people who actually know how to write sci-fi. I mean, just a thought, right? But yeah, this episode, it's creepy. It has a good parody of a global corporation, this time Amazon. It does it in a clever way. It doesn't beat you over the head with any of its messaging, other than the fact that the white guy is the villain, but that's not a huge deal. You know, it's just a decent episode of Doctor Who that's not entertainingly bad. It's just quite good. I'd give this one a 7 out of 10. You know, it's one of those episodes that's not going to be that memorable in years to come, but it was decent, and that's all I really want from Chibnall at this point, is to have decent Doctor Who, and we got that with KaBlam, and I only wish that it had carried on. Now, I believe it was Pete McTeague who wrote this episode, so they need to get Pete McTeague to write most of Series 11. I might be getting that name confused, I'm not sure, but I believe it was him, and if it was him, you need to get him back BBC to do more, because he wrote the best episode of Series 11, hands down, like, no question about it. It's still the golden nugget in a pile of shit, but it's still a golden nugget, you know. It's one of those episodes that you're going to look back on and say, that was pretty good. Not memorable, but pretty good. So, that's how I rank every episode of Doctor Who Series 11 from worst to best. This one was a really difficult list to make, because a lot of them are really bad, and a lot of them are the worst in their own unique way. But I hope you enjoyed me talking about this anyway. I thought I'd do something a bit different, because I've been focusing on Doctor Who Series 12 news, so I thought I'd do something a bit different and rank each individual episode from worst to best. If you enjoyed this video though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on the video. Thanks for all the support recently, by the way. I know I say that in a lot of my videos, but seriously guys, you guys have been killing it recently. My last 3 videos have all reached 1k, which is bonkers. I remember times where I used to struggle to get to 100 views, so to see the channel doing this well, it warms my heart, honestly. And to see you coming back and talking about Doctor Who with me is fantastic. So be sure to comment down below your list of worst to best Series 11 episodes. I wouldn't blame you if you said they were all the worst, but yeah, comment that down below. Also comment down below your ranking of the Doctors. I would really like to see how you all rank the Doctors. I always like to see that. And also, while you're down there, why not take a look at the Patreon? I've been pushing this more in my last couple of videos, but Patreon would really help me out, obviously. The YouTube monetization isn't all it's cracked up to be, so if you really want to help this channel, the links will be down in the description for the Patreon page. Yeah, so go and have a look. Even $1 a month makes all the difference, and I really appreciate it. Obviously, I'm still recording these on my laptop, so this one in particular is probably going to take a while to edit, but because it's just so long. But thank you all for watching. Comment, like, and subscribe. Just gently poke that like button, and I will see you